Hey folks, my name's Kevin and it's time for some pretty freaking cool knife nerdery, because today we have not one, not two, not three, but 4 different versions spanning 3 different generations of this incredibly cool knife. This is the Mini Opiate by Black Snow Customs. We'll talk all about who and what that is in just a moment, but first I wanted to mention that these were sent my way by Slice Fine Knives, who are also the exclusive retailer for this production version of this knife. So first, huge thank you to Matt over at Slice Fine Knives for giving me the chance to check these all out. And second, if this pretty wild and amazing knife is catching your eye, this is where you're going to want to look when this newest version finally drops.
Okay, quick update. These are dropping this Friday at noon Central Time at slicefineknives.com. I'll have a link down below where you'll be able to find all the details, pricing, configuration, everything like that. And like I said, this is the exclusive retailer for this, so please go check them out.
So if you're not already familiar, Black Snow Customs is the name of Israeli custom knife maker Nati Amor. Now, Nati's been making knives for roughly a dozen years now, but professionally only for about 6 or 7. But right from the very beginning, his knives, they made a really big splash in the custom knife world, and they also commanded pretty dang high prices. We're talking multiple thousands of dollars for his customs. The big part of the reason for that is because before transitioning to knives, Nati spent the better part of 2 decades making high-end jewelry. So it's fair to say that he came into the knife making world already possessing quite a lot of expertise in achieving flawless finishes on rare and exotic materials. Another big part of it, however, is just the type of designs that Nati makes. These are big, bold, striking knives with a lot of gravitas and style. They're kind of wild-looking knives with a primal quality to them. They're also literally big. His first design, the Sabotage, is a behemoth 4 1/4 inch blade. He makes the kind of knives that you just don't really ever find in the normal production knife space. And that's why it's just so dang cool that he partnered with Slice to make this production version, the Mini Opiate, available. Now, these things aren't cheap. We'll get to the price later, but they're a tiny fraction of what Nati's customs go for. And like I said, this is the Mini Opiate. He scaled down the giant 3.9-inch blade on the full size to a much more practical and pocketable 3.2 inches. Now, all of these things make this version of the knife way more attainable and functional, honestly, for the average knife enthusiast. And that's why I really love this space, this kind of production version of custom knives. You'll find it in similar things like the Jaeger M from Brian Brown or the Maverick S from Christensen Knife Works. All of those were also made by Reate, is who made this as well. Oh, and 2 fun facts before we move on. So Nati got some publicity outside the normal knife community about a year ago when Aquaman himself, Jason Momoa, featured 2 of Nati's knives on his Instagram.
There it is. And so sharp. Be fun.
It's always really fun when you learn that a celebrity is legitimately a knife person, and you can see the genuine glee in Jason's reactions as he opened these up. He's definitely a knife guy. The other thing I want to point out is that there's actually a fun little coincidence in this particular partnership, since Slice Fine Knives itself was actually a spin-off of Cut Fine Jewelers. So it's fun knowing that both sides of this project started selling fine jewelry before transitioning into selling fine knives. So let's get started. Why exactly do I have 4 different instances of this knife on my table? Well, this one here is the original prototype for the first production run, which we have a representative of here. These 2 over here are the prototypes of the new production run that's coming out soon. There's been some meaningful changes from each stage to the next, so it's so freaking cool getting to see these all side by side and see how everything has evolved. I love so much that Matt sent all of these along at once. This is exactly the kind of thing I love to nerd out about. Now let's start off by talking about what is obviously one of the most important parts of any knife, but on this knife it's definitely one of the things that gives it so much of its kind of presence, and that's this enormous blade. Now, this is also one of the things that has remained pretty much the same across all of the generations of this knife. You'll see that on this prototype for the Gen 1, we have a stonewash finish. And on the Gen 1, the micarta version did have a stonewash, and the carbon fiber version had this hand satin. Now, over here on the Gen 2 prototype, we have the hand satin even on the micarta. I'm not 100% sure what finishes will be available on the end version, so just make sure you check the website before you place an order. This hand satin finish from Reate is absolutely gorgeous, and it's also a finish that Nati has used all the time on his own custom knives. And so I think this finish is going to give you the most kind of authentic to the custom feel. Now, this is the Mini Opiate, and I mentioned that this is only a 3.2 inch blade. That's measured from the tip of this handle here out to this edge, and it's just over 3 inches in cutting length since you have this finger choil here. Now, that might not sound like a very large knife, but this has enough visual and literal weight to it, especially because of just how tall this is, that this does not feel like a small knife, even at that blade size. That's primarily coming from two things. One is that this has 0.153 inch blade stock, and that is typically something that I consider kind of thick for an EDC knife. I don't normally think of knives with this thick of blade stock as being good slicers, but there's an important thing here, and that's how tall this blade is and how long it takes to get up to that. And so there's a paradoxical thing where this can actually still be a really, really good slicer. Let's talk about that a little bit more. What we have here is a varying size grind. You can see that the flat portion here extends all the way out to the tip. And so the top of this is going to be that full 1.153 the entire way. But at the back, it takes about an inch to get to that point. And at the front, it takes a full 1.4 inches to get to that. That's a very, very tall grind. I measured that the entire path along the way, it's about 19,000 on the edge. And so you can tell that the actual grind itself is changing angle as it's going to make that take longer to thin out. It's a really, really cool way they're doing that. But how does it impact slicing? Let's compare this is the Pena X Series Large Apache, and this is a knife with a much more typical vertical dimensions for this blade size. You can see that this blade size here is basically the exact same thing. We're about 3.2 inches. But the blade is so much smaller. So this is 0.12 inch blade stock, but the blade grind here is only 0.6 inches. And so what that means is it takes only 0.6 inches to get up to that full 0.12 blade stock. Comparably over here, if you measure the thickness of this blade at that 0.6 inches, it's at only 90 thousandths. So it's a full third thinner over here than it is on this knife. What's actually a lot more comparable is something like this. This is the Kvist Blade Works PE2. And this is 0.12 blade stock, but a full inch tall. And this geometry is actually fantastic for slicing. And the reality is, if you measure the blade thickness on the Opiate at that same 1 inch grind height, it's also 0.12. And so the reality is for the first inch that you're cutting into the material, the cutting geometry on these two blades is actually identical. They're going to have the same sensation as you're pushing into the material. Now, whether or not the fact that this continues to expand as you go up matters is going to depend on what you are cutting and how resistive it is to splaying to the side. If you're cutting through something like standard cardboard, the thing you find on an Amazon box, or that even thinner stuff you find on like a flat rate shipping box from USPS, that kind of material is very easy to splay to the side. And the further you get away from the actual cut point itself, the more torque that you have, because the further your lever arm distance trying to push that top of the material away. So it's actually really easy with cutting geometry like this to cut through that kind of material. It's going to easily splay to the side, and the cutting geometry below is so thin that it's easily going to continue that cut. Where it will matter, where you're never going to get around this thick blade stock, is if you have material that simply won't splay. Something like styrofoam or an apple, something that's going to want to crack rather than bend off to the side. And that kind of thing, this knife will always wedge in something like an apple. It just will. There's nothing you can get around that. And so if you're going to be using this as an apple chopper all day long, this might not be the perfect knife for you. But once you actually get that initial cut through, when you actually turn that other half of the apple in on its side, you're really only cutting with this bottom portion of the blade right here. And so it actually would cut perfectly fine through the rest of the apple. Anyway, the result is that even though it has thick blade stock, it can still be an exceptional slicer depending on what you're cutting. The other thing I'd like to talk about for the blade is this is the plunge grind back here, and you can see that we have a full-on finger choil, not just a sharpening choil. So the plunge grind is the thing that takes you from the full thickness of the blade stock down to the thinness behind the edge. And you can see that it ends right about here. And so that is so deep. You're never going to sharpen this knife up to the point where you would actually start to smile. If you did, you would dramatically change the appearance of this knife. That finger choil, by the way, fits really, really nicely in my hand. It's not a huge finger choil, but you can see they nicked off the very edge of this blade here. So if you do have a bigger finger than mine, it's not going to kind of puncture you on that back tip. One last nice thing about the fact that this remains thick this entire way is that it's very, very comfortable to put as much force as you want on with your finger along that spine. Sometimes when knives thin out, it can be kind of awkward or uncomfortable to push along the thinner point around there. And with this, man, you can put a lot of force in. So if you are using a utility type cut, where you're cutting on a surface and you're likely only using the very bottom part of the blade because you're cutting out paper, cutting out cardboard, cutting out shipping labels, who knows what you're doing, it's actually really easy to put a lot of comfortable force on this and get that nice thin edge down there into whatever material you're cutting with. So this is actually really, really good for precise utility cuts. Loved that. So let's start talking about some of the things that have changed from generation to generation. Between the prototype and the first production run, there's really only two things that I notice here. The most obvious visual one is the loss of this pivot collar. So on almost all of Nati's customs, he has some kind of prominent pivot collar. It's part of the aesthetic that he has. And so I was actually really sad to see that go. Now, this very large round pivot here is still very visually striking. This knife still has quite a large feature here that's going to draw your eye. And I know some people really love this, but a lot of people, this was a turnoff. For me, it was just kind of disappointing because I really like the look of this. We've got an outer ring of titanium and then an inner ring which matches the material of the handle. And so I was really, really pleased to see that this came back on Gen 2. The only other difference between the prototype and the Gen 1 that I was able to find here is that the size of this lock bar relief was reduced slightly. It might be hard for you to tell, and it's actually kind of subtle, but this went from 0.278 inches to only 0.243. The impact of shortening this lock bar relief is that the lock bar is simply less flexible. And so what I found is that the lock bar is significantly stiffer. It puts a lot more pressure on this, and it's a lot harder to push over. That's actually a pretty big disappointment to me because I think it feels perfect on the prototype. And I don't find there's any need for additional lock bar pressure from a detent perspective. This flies right out. So I was kind of surprised to find that. It's not that it puts too much pressure on. You can see that this, even with all of the additional pressure of this is the kind of knife that's still able to do that. So is it a bad thing? I don't know, but I like it a lot better on the prototype. So that's also something I was really pleased to see they switched back for on the second version. They increased that size of that cutout just a little bit back up to the original size. And so the lock bar pressure here is basically the same, and you do get that same kind of fall home. Now moving from Gen 1 to Gen 2, this is where the really significant change happens. Like I said before, we do get that pivot collar back, but there's a really substantial change that you will see immediately when we look at it from above. On the original version, we have sandwich construction style, where you have a slab of titanium and then a slab of whatever your liner material is, whether it is micarta or carbon fiber. And that's visual from the outside, visual from the bottom, it's visual from all angles. When we go from Gen 1 to Gen 2, that liner is now recessed and hidden within the scale. So the entire size of it has been shrunken down in this dimension, and the scale material is now thicker and is able to wrap around it on the inside. I personally think that this is visually just so much cleaner. I vastly prefer the look of this on the new version. I really, really like it. But there is an interesting paradox here where this style, where it's sandwich and you can see the entire way, is actually the kind of thing you would find on his customs. And that's actually true for a lot of handmade custom knife makers. The kind of people who are using hand-powered tools like files or hand-controlled power tools, that basically anything that's not CNC'd. And the reason is because it would actually be incredibly hard, near impossible, for a maker using that kind of tools to mill out a perfect channel path inside one of these handle scales in order to nest it down inside. That's the kind of thing that you kind of need to be using CNC for. And so this is one of those things where on a custom you would find it like this, but only on a production version using high-end CNC are you going to be able to find this. You'll also immediately notice that those liners have been anodized. On the original version, it's just raw titanium looking with a nice bead blast finish, but on the V2, inside the knife, it has been anodized to match the accent colors. Those themselves weren't anodized on the original version, so it's cool to see that the pivot collars, the screws, the backspacer, and the clip have all been anodized in a fun color that pops against the original, or in the case of the micarta, blends in really nice. You've got this beautiful bronze finish everywhere. I think that is a really, really nice upgrade, and I'm happy to see that. It's worth noting that the thickness of the liner itself hasn't changed, but that slight, tiny bit of material that's been removed right there will make it thinner in this dimension. And so, like I said, they increased the size of this lock bar relief back to what it was on the original prototype. And so overall, the lock bar is the easiest to push over on these Gen 2s, and I think it just feels great. I think some people will still have problems accessing the lock bar in this knife if they have really thick thumbs though. You can see that there's only a subtle chamfer right here and right here, and so even though it's not hard at all for me, I think that some people might have an issue, and it's surprising to me that it is as small as it is. This is not a thin knife, so there would have been plenty of room to increase the size of this chamfer, and so that's something I would have liked to have seen change between these generations. It's also worth pointing out that on both versions, this lock bar liner is thick enough that they're able to have a steel lock bar insert. You often don't find that on liner locks, but it's really cool to see that. And you can see right there the little screw that's holding it in. Another fun detail as we look inside here, let's shine a little bit of light in. Do you see that right there? That says Black Snow, and it's fun. I love when the maker's mark is hidden inside the knife, and that's also what he does on his customs too. So it's nice to see that carried over here. The end result of that, of course, is that this is a completely sterile knife. Everything on this is clean and sleek, and I adore that. But what you don't find is a steel indicator. So that is actually one of the things that has changed between Gen 1 and Gen 2. On the first version, this blade steel is RWL34. If you're not familiar with what that is Damastil's version of CPM 154. It's a powder metallurgy version of 154 CM. It's a great steel, but it's not like an uber modern super steel. Now, he chose that for this because that's the steel that he uses in his customs a lot. He uses RWL34 all the time. And so in order to make it feel as accurate to his customs and also just something that he's very comfortable and familiar with the performance of, he kept that on this version. Now, it turns out that they actually had difficulty sourcing the RWL34 when they needed to for the second batch. And so on the Gen 2, the blade steel has been changed to M390. I personally consider that a slight upgrade. But honestly, both of those steels work well enough, especially on this kind of knife where this is a kind of fancy high-end knife that I think a lot of people are going to be buying for a collective purpose. And so at that point, I think you're not going to really be able to notice the performance difference with the kind of lighter use that most people are going to do this for. This is not a knife that needs to be used for light use. This is a very sturdy knife, but I think if I'm being realistic, I think most people are probably not going to use this for the kind of thing where they'd be able to tell the difference between RWL34 and M390. Now, I mentioned that these are not thin knives. The blade steel is not thin, and the overall thickness of the handle itself is definitely not thin. That is in keeping with his big hand-filling customs. What we have here is 0.653 inches on the carbon fiber versions and nearly identical 0.647 on the micarta. I found that was actually the same across both generations, that the micarta was ever so slightly thinner. Don't know why. But either way, what you have at 0.65 is a pretty good hand-filling knife. This is not going to be slim, and you will definitely notice that girth in your pocket if you're not used to carrying that kind of thing. But overall, I found that this actually carried pretty well. The entire thing is sleek back here in a way that makes it so that you don't worry about sliding against anything. And this is important, usually when you have thick blade steel like this, there's a risk that you're going to be able to touch that edge back here because the gap in the handle is big enough. But I found that you can't really get it unless you're really, really trying. And so I never found any kind of fear that I might accidentally cut myself when sliding my hand in my pocket. The other thing for carry is weight. So now, these are not light knives, but they're also not absurdly heavy, and they kind of feel in line with what you'd expect for the overall physical size of this. Like again, it's a shorter blade, but it's a really broad blade. And so the fact that the originals weighed 5¼ ounces, 5.23-ish on the carbon fiber and 5.158 on the micarta, meant that it didn't really feel heavy. You feel the heft, but it doesn't feel heavier than you expect when you go to pick it up. Now, shrinking the size of the titanium liners slightly to make them nested like this does reduce the weight. And I was actually surprised by how much it reduced it. You're only taking the liners in that tiny small distance, but that small distance all around adds up to a full 1/4 ounce. And so these new versions come in just under 5 ounces, 4.944 and 4.956 in the micarta. And it's just enough that you really can tell the difference. It feels noticeably lighter than the original, but this is still a knife that has some heft to it as you pick it up. It Honestly, I was expecting it to weigh even a little bit more given the size, and so I was really kind of pleased with how comparably little this weighs. The balance point is also pretty nice. What we're talking about is right about here. Now that's because of how much weight is in this blade that they're able to move this far forward. We're right behind this flipper tab, just like at the very back edge of this flipper tab, which means that you have a really good sense of balance if you're holding in this choke back grip, because it's right at the tip of your pointer. And if you are choked up and using that finger choil, it's now right in between these. And so both of those grips, this feels balanced. You don't feel like the back or the front is swinging around in your hand. And so it's pretty easy to tell where the tip of this knife is. The other thing for carry is this clip. The clip has remained the same across all 4 versions, except for the fact that it is anodized in the new versions, and this is actually a really, really nice clip. So what we have here is a mill tie clip, but it's wide enough on this end that it's able to use 2 screws positioned this way, and as a result, you actually have a pretty short connector at the back here. The whole thing is going to sit in your pocket, revealing only about that much, and given how big this knife is, I was amazed to see how little actually sticks out of your pocket. That was great. It also has a very long ramp in this direction, and so I found it very easy to pull this in and out of the pocket. There's really nice retention too. It's just springy enough, but it snaps all the way down with enough force that this clip worked really, really well. The other thing for carry for some folks is that there is still a lanyard hole. This is something that carried over on all 4 versions. He didn't change it whatsoever. This is the kind of lanyard hole that I really like to see, where you don't see it from the front or the back. You really only see it at the top or from the back like that, because there's just a post worked into the back spacer here. There's a little gap right there, and so it would stick straight out the back. That's the other thing, is that a lot of times people will put it somewhere further up and make the lanyard stick out the top of the knife, which is just not what you want. You want the lanyard to be able to come out backwards from the knife so that it lays linearly flat into your hand when you're holding it or trying to pull it out of your pocket. So I love this style of lanyard hole if there has to be one. So let's get into action. So this knife has a delightful action. It has a flipper tab right here that has the kind of shape and positioning that makes you know it's meant to be a push button. You can technically hook on the front of this and pull back with a light switch. It works perfectly fine, but there's a nice flat pad here with just a little bit of jimping. And if you look at where the angle that you'd be pushing in, it's pushing just past the pivot. What that means is you get a really good kind of ability to preload if you want, but just then snap down and it flies out. I really, really love that. And then on the close, you can see it's just a delightful guillotine. It's not so fast on these ones that you worry that it's going to like kind of catch you on your way down, but it just falls with such a nice thunk into place. I absolutely love the opening action on this knife. When we moved to the production version and they increased the lock strength here, like I said, that's going to increase more pressure on the blade as it's trying to close, and that's going to be more friction as a result. And so I was worried that this knife wouldn't close the same as the others. And you can see that it's able to sit upright like this. But if I just tilt it just a little bit, it closes all the way home. Some people are going to like this kind of action even better because it is that kind of float home that is actually pretty hard to find on knives. And that's something that's only getting because of the additional lock bar strength here. The fact that these newer versions have less lock bar strength means that it is going to be a slightly more of a fall fast close. But on all of these, it's still the kind of thing where you can really easily get your finger out of the way and not worry about it. So I really like the way these close. You might be noticing something as I'm going over here though. I'm having to close this slightly further in order to do this kind of fall close home. And that's because the other really big change that's happened is in Gen 2, they've added a detent bolt ramp. The original version closes at about 21 degrees before you hit the detent ball. And so you have to get it past this distance in order for it to fall home. I would always like to see something closer to 10 degrees of close so that you don't have to go quite as far in order to be able to get up onto that detent ball. I find that especially true on knives with flipper tabs, because with flipper tabs, that flipper tab is going to be moving towards your thumb, and it's often hard to close this in a way that's not going to have the flipper tab close down on your thumb. I don't find that to be the problem with this one because of how kind of short this flipper tab is in that dimension, so it never really hits me, and I'm kind of where I find myself pushing and where this scallop encourages you to push is below where that would even go in the first place. There is a risk with this though. Even though it's easy to get up on this detent ball, it would also be easy if you're holding this fully upright to have this fall to your nail. And this isn't the kind of knife that I feel comfortable having fall to my nail. You can see where it's landing. It's that back corner of the blade would be landing right into my hand. And if you're doing it at a slight angle, like that, it's not closing super fast, but you can see even there, it made a slight mark in my thumb, and this is a heavy enough blade that I don't let this thing fall to my thumb. I'm worried that it's going to take a nick out of me. And so with the Gen 1, I close it to here, and then just let it fall. With the Gen 2 adding in a detent ball ramp, what that means is when you go and close it to that same 21-degree angles, there's now a ramp that you can push up. And it does make it meaningfully easier to close it. And some people will love this, the type of people who want to go like this and push a blade home. That's what detent ramps are great for. If you're the type of person that pushes a blade with your finger or pushes it with your hand when you're closing it, and for two hands for some reason, detent ball ramps make it a lot easier to push past that detent ball. But it does mean that you have to get a little bit further closed in order to be past that detent ball ramp if you want to do the kind of thing where you then let it free fall home. Because if you stop a little bit too early and you're still on that ramp, it doesn't quite want to fall the same way. The reality though is it's not that big of a deal on this. If I get it just on the top of the ramp, this still will fall home because of just how dang heavy this is. In fact, if I close this to the point where it's not actually up the ramp at all, it's just at the start of the ramp. Most knives, the detent ball ramp, if you kind of bounce it here, it will pop back open. This blade has enough weight to it that you can actually swing up that ramp really, really easily. So I don't know. I find that because of the fact it pushes up the ramp when I'm closing it like this, I find it a little bit trickier, but it's the kind of thing that you could get used to really easily. And if you don't want to end up pushing past the ramp, if you want to just see right there, you can, like I said, swing it right past it. So that's one of those changes that I think is, I could kind of take it or leave it. Some people will love it. For some types of closers, it's going to be a lot better. But for me, with the fact that it's so fun to have this go like that, I kind of almost prefer it without it, but it's certainly not hurting anything here. Now, speaking of this, I wanted to point out something that's really, really cool. The way that they're doing this is interesting. If you see, the lock face is right here, like you would normally expect to find. But if we shine a light down and look at this, there's no detent ball right there. Where is it? In fact, we can only see the detent ball if we turn this around and turn our angle to there. Now, how do you see the detent ball? What's going on here is the lock bar is actually cut in a way. So this is where the lock face is right here. And then it's cut up and extends further past that flipper tab. And it's up here on an extension of the lock bar that the detent ball is placed. Let's see if we can zoom in and show that from above. So I'm about to have this pop open and you can see where the detent ball is. It's sitting all the way up there. And then back up here is where the lock face is. So that the lock bar actually extends this entire distance past the lock face up here, and that's where the detent ball is placed. Really cool technique. So why do they do that? Why would someone bother making that kind of more complicated construction? Well, that's because by having it extend up past the lock face, they're able to position the detent ball even closer to the pivot. The closer that you can get the detent ball to the pivot, the shorter its lever arm distance is. And so when you're talking about something like closing action like this, the force that the detent ball is applying on the blade has some lever arm distance. And so there's actually a resistive torque, that force times lever arm distance, that is applying the friction on the blade to allow it to close. The smaller you can make that lever arm distance means that for a given pressure from a lock bar, the less resistive friction it will actually experience. And so the easier it is to have a free fall close home. So that's a big part of how they're able to pull off this amazing free fall action. Part is that the blade itself is just a big, heavy blade. That's a huge factor. But the other part is this clever way of placing the detent ball even closer to the pivot than you normally would be able to given where the lock face is. I love to see that. Now, I do notice a significant difference in the action between these two prototypes. I don't know if that's intentional or not, and I don't know how much that's going to carry over to the production version, but the detent on this one is just dang near perfect. This is so delightfully snappy. It's, I would say, a perfect detent. It flies open and yet still falls home so well. The action on this one is seriously perfection. Now over here, the detent is just a smidge lighter. And as a result, it's possible to fail this. If I really try, I can make that happen. And I can't really do that over here. it can still easily fly out, but you can definitely notice. The other place where you can notice this is just the overall strength of the detent in terms of keeping it in. Over here, this is nice and clicky. And if you shake this, it takes a significant force to get it to come out. Under normal conditions, it's not going anywhere. You have to really kind of thwack it. This one, because it has a lighter detent, yeah, you can kind of get it to come out a lot more easily. Now, the reason for that is entirely detent ball engagement in the closed position. So if we look at how far in this detent ball goes, yeah, do you see how much of that you can see sticking out right there? Now compare that over here, it's a lot less. This is sticking in a lot farther, and that's really the only difference. I couldn't tell any difference in actual lock bar pressure between the two. It's just that detent ball engagement. And since this one is absolute perfection, I really hope that they dial that in and get that perfect across all of them. I don't know if this was intentional to experience two different things or not, but if that is, if there's any way that they're doing this intentionally to try and do an A/B test or something like that, this is the one to go with. It's perfect. Okay, let's start talking about my final thoughts on this, and this is where the price is going to come in. I don't actually know the final price that this V2 is going to be, but the V1 was $395. That is a lot. These are Reate-made knives, and so Reate-made knives tend to be expensive. When you get a fancy brand in there, you get a designer like Christensen Knife Works or Brian Brown, the price is going to go even more, because what you're getting here is you're paying for a design. A lot of this is the visual style and aesthetic that you really only can get from a custom maker like this. And so when they do a version of a knife in the Reate, it's just going to cost more. You're paying that custom maker tax on top. Now, this is on the high end of even that. It's rare to find these things up above $400, but it's not that uncommon. And so the reality is this isn't going to be accessible to all people, but this is accessible enough that I think this is going to be very popular. And I think that people that like the style of this and that are big fans of Black Snow but can't shell out $5,000 to get one of his customs are going to jump at the chance to spend $400 on one of these. It's possible that this Gen 2 is going to be slightly more expensive. I don't know. The reason why I think it might is because the pivot collar is the kind of thing that adds some cost to the knife. The anodization will add some cost to the knife. The recessed liners is significantly more complicated. All of the things might add up to a higher price. But depending on how much higher it is, I think it's probably worth it for all those changes, because all of those things make this version of the knife just a lot more compelling than this version, and this is already something that I think is amazing. So I think that if you want this knife for a collection piece, like if you love the style of this and you've always wanted something from Black Snow Customs, I think this knife is absolutely worth it. I think it is not pushing the value proposition if you're trying to get a budget knife, but if you're trying to get a budget knife, you're never going to be shopping for something in this space anyway. From a functionality perspective, this knife feels great in your hand. It feels great in different grips. It cuts really, really well, especially if you're cutting something that's already going to become fully cut from this first part distance, because it's still quite thin at that point. So if you actually want this as a user, I think this would work really, really well too, especially if you're doing the kind of thing where you're doing utility cuts with this tip. It's so good for that. So is this knife worth it? I think that's going to be a decision up to you. I think it is personally, because I love the style of this. I think this knife is incredible. And I'm the type of person that will shell out that kind of money for a knife that has that much kind of pull to it stylistically for me. I hope you all enjoyed this. Thank you for watching, and I'll catch you guys next time.